session. You can also raise your hand, as is common in these webinars. So let us proceed. Let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Adil Malik. I'm an associate professor at the University of Oxford. I'm very delighted to be chairing this session. Our first speaker, Mounir Mahmalat, is a senior researcher at the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, and his paper deals with the issue of legislative reform in the midst of uncertainty, in a crisis-induced uncertainty, in a fractionalized polity, Lebanon, which is increasingly in the news. So, Mounir, over to you. Please start.
Thank you so much, Adil. Thank you so much for the audience and for this opportunity, ERF. Thank you so much. Please bear with me as a health issue that I have to take care of in the after of incredible that happened last week. So I will reconnect via folder after so much for that. I will share my screen. And will introduce to you a paper that I have authored together with Sami, the director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Institute, for Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. I should get the name straight. Dubbed Crisis, Uncertainty, and Reform. What we really want to do in this paper is disentangling the mechanisms of this conventional wisdom, in particular in fractionalized polities. And we will come up with a counterintuitive argument trying to explain why crises sometimes fail to introduce reform. I will give you a very brief motivation and framework, and then we'll spend most of the time of this presentation on the empirical and data, because we only have preliminary results at this point, and give a quick conclusion. So the big question, the big elephant in the room in so many countries' settings is really, do crises actually facilitate reform? And by reform, we mean political collaboration, political get together when a situation gets very bad and not only moderately bad. And this is really conventional wisdom in the literature on political economic things, where crises are considered to be a political vehicle to have crisis and to have reform happening and change happening. However, if you review the literature, and I have done it in a exercise 2 years ago, then we see that the evidence is surprisingly inconclusive, and the mechanisms by which crises are supposed to induce reform are underdetermined. What we do in this paper is to offer a theory to micro mechanisms by which crisis can impact political collaboration on reform. And the application by which we're doing that is on fractionalized clientelist societies, which is here the case of Lebanon. And what we are saying is that the degree to which crisis can affect political collaboration depends critically on the incentive structures of political actors to rally political support. The way we are investigating that is within a novel and legislative activity in Lebanon that is comprehensive from independence until today. And what our preliminary results suggest is that suggest an explanation why crisis sometimes can fail to do that. We are thereby contributing to the literature on the impact of crisis, and in particular the ambiguous results that we see there. So why concern in the first place? As Adil, as you mentioned already, is increasingly now all over the news for the overlapping multiple crises that the poor country at the moment faces. I don't have to introduce you into that. And right now, the hot topic within Lebanon is how to respond to these crises and what to expect going forward from the political elite of the country. That is some brief definitions to go forward to actually understand what we're talking about. So we identify crisis from a constructivist perspective. And that's actually very important, by which we deviate from much of the political economy literature out there that is more quantitatively focused. We define crisis as moments of significant uncertainty about the post-crisis distribution of political power. And Well, the important aspect here is that political actors cannot determine with certainty their objective functions and have to interpret the political realities in which they're operating based on their own imperatives. And that's the crucial distinction here. It doesn't matter if a crisis is defined by inflation having 20% or 50% about the intersubjective belief of actors that something needs to change. And I'm going to talk about in a minute how we're going to operate. What are we talking about? We talk about fractionalization. We define it as a number of politically salient groups with veto powers that are involved in political collaboration. Now, much literature has been is out there about how fractionalization can delay reform, which is in particular related to veto player theory. If it comes to empirical literature, again, we have actually counterintuitive results where fractionalization is found even to reduce the incidence of reform in times of crisis. And so in terms of political collaboration, we are basing on the literature of political transactions, defined as the engagement into credible categories. And here is focus really on the intertemporal nature of political collaboration. It's basically saying, I'm going to offer you my vote to the law and give me to the law. Why do my? The extent to which this can be made credible determines the polity can process more complex legislation. I'm talking a little bit about this in a second. This makes it susceptible to ties. Now, what we're talking about here is therefore the outcome of a collaboration game, which I think is quite important to distinguish, because reform often is depicted as this structural concept, this global concept of change, which I think, when it comes to the mechanisms by which reform actually happens, has to be dissected into different ways in which political actors process legislation in the first place. And when it comes to the Lebanese constitution, we have in particular 3 different types of legislations that are of relevance in this context: laws, decrees, resolutions, which have different issuing bodies and different what we call institutional friction. So laws have the highest amount of voting procedures, for example, and the amount of laws and institutions and economists working on specific legal text, while decrees and resolutions that are really only issuance of executive power, the less of that. Now, why is it important to dissect that? Because we have a different institutional friction depending on both the breadth of impact of a specific legislation, as well as the hierarchy in which the legislative hierarchy of a specific text, which then is a function, again, go back to the last slide, the issuing body of a text. And why is this important? Because we know that some of the legislation that we see occurring has a different way to impact interest groups and people within the country. We have in particular one group of legislation, if we make it really stylized, that is regulatory issues or amends generally applicable rules or regulations that are so therefore independent of a specific person, organization, or more administrative regulation that really applies to one specific instance of an individual or an organization or the. If we're putting into a matrix, then we can have a more clear dissection of how legislation has a different different requirements of being enacted. I'm highlighting that because I want to argue that we can see changes in the patterns of political collaboration based on these different
Hello,
on the
Mounir.
friction of
Can
the legislation. Yes.
can I interrupt you? A lot of people
Please, please, please.
cannot easily hear you. Is there something you
Okay.
could do at your end to increase your volume or make it clearer?
Because volume actually, because it's interrupted.
Okay, we can't hear you very properly. Is this a stable internet connection, or wonder what we can do? Okay, so I think I've been told by the ERF people is basically your connection is very weak. Your connection is very weak. So let's try and wind this up quickly. I can share the link to your presentation or your paper with the audience as well, but let's give it another try. I think we have lost his connection. So I suggest that till we restore the connection, why don't I take you guys through my comments so that you get a sense of what his paper is arguing. You won't have the benefit of his fantastic presentation, but at least I can try and do some justice to what the paper really aims at doing. So let me try and share my screen, which has got my comments. Okay, so here is the screen shared with you. Basically, this is a paper that looks at, the fundamental idea in political economy, which is about how crises, different kinds of crises, enable reform. And one of the ways it can enable reform is by affording political collaboration, right? So it allows disparate political groups to come together. Now, it takes the insights of this sort of crisis and reform literature and applies it to a factionalized clientelist policies such as polities such as Lebanon. Mounir, in your absence, I've started giving some comments. I think there's some issue with your connection. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to summarize some of the things, and you can perhaps come in. Okay. Okay. So I don't know if you can hear us. All righty.
Yes,
so
yes. Thank you.
Okay, so the main motivation and the proposition of this is that political actors are incentivized to reform when there is a crisis, because a crisis sort of breaks the political equilibrium. And this could result in collaboration, including collaborating on constitutional provisions that might underpin reform. On the other hand, we know that politicians tend to delay reform when the benefits of a particular reform are less than the cost of reform. The reform is more costly. Or if they're unsure about the cost of how those costs of reform will be distributed. And I think that point is very relevant in the context of Lebanon because of the fractionalized polity that it is. And the third key motivation is that the actor incentives can be radically different in a fractionalized polity because that could be geared towards clientelistic distribution. So the overall frame of the paper is really to take this reform literature, sort of crisis and reform literature, and see whether that applies in the Lebanese context. In order to do that, the paper basically compiles a lot of interesting data on legislative activity in Lebanon. And it compiles information on all the primary and secondary legislations from 1943 to 2019. It then runs two separate models of legislations per week for regulatory laws and decrees and for administrative resolutions and decrees. So it's sort of two types of legal activity. Now, the preliminary analysis suggests that there's a lot more political collaboration before the 2005 and 2019 crisis, and a crisis is defined when, the government of the day is forced to leave. It's almost like what happened yesterday could be construed as a crisis because the government was forced to leave. And the paper then shows that the bulk of legislative activity revolves around clientelistic services. So in the 2019 crisis, we see a lot of legislative activity around the issuing of licenses. And in the 2005 crisis, we see lots of registrations of associations. So a lot of these, this legislative activity revolves around these two mechanisms. Now, overall, I find that this is clearly a very preliminary stage for this paper, but there's an impressive data effort on a very important aspect of Lebanese political economy. It actually frames the paper around very interesting political economy paradigm, proposes an interesting typology of legislative hierarchy and the breadth of reform that Mounir was taking us through, and unfortunately we couldn't hear him properly, but all his slides and papers are online. In the end, he sort of generates a very fascinating pattern that has relevance for understanding legislative reform when a crisis leads to uncertainty and factionalized polity. But for me, this paper is still a stylized fact. It's still a paper that is presenting us an interesting puzzle. But I've got some questions and suggestions for it. So one question that is sort of latent to this paper is the sort of sectarian dimension. How important is the sectarian dimension? Can one distinguish these different legislations by types of beneficiaries that are linked with oligarchic and sectarian interests? So I would guess that a lot of the licenses issued or the associations issued, we need to know more about what types of these legislations were and who could be the beneficiaries. There's a need to unbundle some of these categories. So for example, what types of associations are being set up, what types of licenses are being issued, and how do we really unbundle this association effect. So as I said, overall, the paper brings together an impressive data effort. It's very relevant, and it produces very interesting facts. But what we now need in the next stage is a very good knowledge of these facts. So far, the empirical setup is more about treatment is the time treatment, before and after the crisis. But we might think about other sort of predetermined sources of variation, bringing them in into the picture. And I have some suggestions which I can share later. Now, so far, the data is from 1943 to 2019. And it focuses on 2 crisis episodes. But I think it would benefit if we learn more about other patterns. So what is the nature of legislative activity during the whole period rather than just these 2 crisis episodes? Are there other breaks in the data? For example, pre-Taif, post-Taif agreement. We know that associational activity is paramount as far as legislative action is concerned, but we would be more informed if we know what types of associations. I mean, typically, if you look at North Wallis-Weingast framework of limited access orders, one of the ways in which a country is characterized as having a limited access order is that there's not enough sort of room to form associations, which is probably not the case in Lebanon. And it provides a very interesting sort of puzzle to that sort of literature. Is this just a Lebanese question? And I think in answering this, it seems to me that it would be a lot more interesting to look at not just the crisis and reform literature in general, but to restrict it to factionalized polities. And if we talk about factionalized polities, Lebanon is a particular factionalized polity which has its own dynamics around the consociational agreement. But we could think of many other cases of fractionalization, and maybe if one could zone in and sort of hone in the hypothesis more into factionalized polities and the types of fractionalization and what insights it generates could be more useful. I think there's also a difference between political crisis versus systematic crisis. And a lot of the mainstream political economy literature that suggests that crisis-induced reform is more about systemic uncertainty, systemic crisis, rather than sort of change of governments. And obviously, reform becomes incentive compatible and becomes more imperative when there's no reform option is more threatening to the elites. Whereas a lot of the crises that we're seeing in Lebanon, you just change the governments and the system remains there. In the paper, the theoretical discussion is quite dense. It can be considerably simplified to generate clear testable predictions. And the paper needs to offer a slightly better context of what the Lebanese political economy is. One final suggestion I have is that given that we are looking at particular kinds of reform, which is more like legislative reform or de jure reform, we are operating in a context where that sort of reform can generate rents for insiders, especially licenses or associations. And an interesting book to consider is The Code of Capital by Christina Pister, that talks about how law itself is an important avenue through which privileges are generated for insiders. So to conclude, this is an excellent paper. There's an impressive data effort there. It presents a great stylized fact, but it's clearly work in progress. And I'm sure that in months and years to come, we'll see a more refined version of it. So I'll stop there and perhaps ask anyone on the floor to respond, because I know Mounir has an appointment and he needs to leave for a doctor's appointment. So let us pose any questions that people have for this presentation. We are sorry it's not ideal. The issue is really from the Lebanese side, where the internet connection is fairly weak. Is there any question that people from the audience would like to pose to this presentation? Feel free to pose the question in the Q&A dialog box, or just raise your hand. Mounir, in the interim, have you got anything to add, or would you like to respond to any of the comments that I've made?
Thank you so much, Adil. I think these were amazing comments and spot on. Very good summary. Thanks for these suggestions.
Okay. I mean, do you think you've got interesting patterns of variation around factionalized polities? I mean, we talk about there are all sorts of divisions. There are countries that suffer from ethnic divisions. There are other kinds of sectarian divisions. There's some divisions that are institutionalized through constitutions, others that aren't. And I wonder if you've got any thoughts on how you could tap into greater variation amongst factionalized societies, and then propose a hypothesis that is more in line with your results, which is to do with how particular kinds of factionalization could create particular kinds of opportunity structures for reform.
Yeah, I mean, that's the hot topic. So I do indeed, data collecting wise, doing this for more than one country is putting this kind of analysis on a comparative basis is an effort that will take more time, to put it mildly.
Would you like?
However, I do think.
Yes, please go ahead.
I do. That's the ultimate goal of this paper, no? To make this argument based on a strong external validity. This must be definitely the next step in trying to find out the scope conditions based on which these arguments can apply. I definitely agree, and my thinking about this is to include a couple of case studies from other countries, such as Iraq, that can illustrate that these mechanisms do indeed apply on other policies.
Can you please tell us a bit more what types of associations are being set up and what types of licenses being given? I mean, these are the two main pieces of legislative activity that happens around the crisis.
Yeah. So I think that's an excellent question, and this must be the next step, one of the next steps, actually. I mean, so many avenues you can go into that. What we have not yet concluded is how to cross the data set that we have with ownership structures of these organizations. There is an opportunity now for us, based on leaked data from the Ministry of Finance, to do that. This is something that needs to be done in the second step. So we don't know yet which of these associations actually have political connections and which don't. However, based on previous work that I have done with ICPS at Sami Atallah, we can, based on a data set of Ishaq Diwan and Jamal Haider, we do show that more than 44% of all firms of more than 50 employees are indeed politically connected. So it's very highly likely that the bulk of those business creations and creations of associations just before government restructurings would indeed be evidencing some form of political connectivity. This is something that we indeed have to show now, that there is a significant correlation of the new established organizations in terms of political connectivity rather than in normal times, vis-a-vis normal times.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mounir. Thank you for taking out the time. I realize that in the wake of what's happened in Lebanon, a lot of things are in a flux, and you yourself have to visit a doctor. We wish you all the very best, and I'm sure that the attendees will find your paper of interest. It's available online on our conference website. Thank you for your participation. May I suggest that we now move to the next presentation, which is by Vladimir Hlasny. I hope I have pronounced it correctly. He is an economics affairs officer at the UN Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. And he's going to talk about inequality and corruption. Vladimir, over to you.
Thank you, Adil. Can you see me and hear me well? Okay,
yes.
Great.
Please go ahead.
So, okay, let me try to share my screen. How do we do that?
So there's a share screen icon at the bottom, right?
Here we go. Okay, I hope you can see my PowerPoint presentation now.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. And so I will be looking at that, and please stop me if the sound quality goes bad, or if you have questions. Anytime during the presentation, please stop me. Okay, so this is a paper that is in progress. I worked on it last year before I started at UN ESQA. That's why I listed my affiliation in the conference materials as IHWA Women's University, where I was affiliated until the end of last year. And so when I wrote this paper, I had no idea that I was coming to Lebanon and about all the events that happened in Lebanon this year. And so, of course, all these events over the past months and last week, now I have to process them to see how this analysis fits in, and how I have to change the analysis to whether I can shed any light on what happened, how the events interact with this story. And so the story in this working paper is not very clear yet. There are interesting results, but I have to come up with a good explanation. Maybe rerun the analysis with newer data, with some perspective from the ground, to get a better sense of what's there. So the paper is about the implications of inequality for corruption. I started on this project with a global perspective to see whether the level of economic development and the type of market system, so variety of capitalism, whether how they interact with the distribution of incomes and wealth, and with political institutions and corruption on the ground. And then I wanted to introduce another dimension to the paper by focusing specifically on the MENA region. So I added MENA as a distinct form of market system and its level of development. and let's say the role of exports of raw materials. So all the institutions in the region, how they would change the story, and kind of the empirical question was whether MENA region would follow the trend that we observe in low income, lower middle, upper middle, high income countries, and let's say would MENA be somewhere between the liberal, the system of liberal market economies, think Anglo-Saxon countries, or the coordinated market economies in Europe, or maybe something like the state-led coordinated market economies in East Asia, and I will show that the results for now are kind of unclear. That it seems that MENA stands out, and I need to come up with a good explanation why that is. Okay, so let me go through it a little bit. So the motivation or the basic story that I started with is that economic inequality should give rise to corruption by creating disparities across social groups, giving some elites or some groups better access to political power, and maybe also giving these groups a scope for special gain from capturing political decisions. So that's the common belief that there should be positive association and maybe positive causality between inequality and corruption. Okay, and so the basic story that motivated this work was: does concentration of economic wealth and economic incomes lead to more abuse of political power and more corruption in countries? We study whether there's something like an inequality trap, whereby more inequality leads to corruption, which further perpetuates the status quo and perpetuates inequality. And so here I can just say that, well, it would be very hard to identify causality between inequality and corruption. Both are very difficult variables to study, very path dependent, very little change in them. And so maybe instead of saying that I'm studying causality, causal effect of inequality on corruption, maybe we can think of it as in some kind of dynamic relationship, that empirical observation that some trend in inequality is associated with trend in corruption in the following years. And that's what I will be identifying and trying to explain. So there's some existing evidence of economic power getting translated into political power, which undermines democracy. There is a literature on the post-democracy, on post-democracy, whereby some economic and political elites dominate decision-making. And one political goal of this discussion is that there's a need to understand and manage economic distribution, not just out of concerns for social justice, but also to safeguard and enhance democracy and democratic participation and political stability. So very specifically, that redistributive fiscal policies may be thought of as an investment in political institutions, not just a humanitarian instrument or a bribe to voters. So there might be a social role and political role for redistributive fiscal policies. What are the channels? So for this, we would have to want to look at the structure of political decision-making in countries and the relations among main political actors, which leads to a hypothesis that perhaps in economies with a different level of coordination. in economies with a different level of coordination, different system of coordination among political actors, we might see a different relationship between inequality and corruption. Let me jump a little bit forward. So there is a reason to suspect that the MENA region might be exceptional. One, there's the empirical observation because there's evidence that the income inequality is relatively moderate, and at the same time, there is evidence of multifaceted corruption that is very high and highly ingrained. There's also literature on the Arab variety of capitalism, which describes unique relations between different parts of the society compared to, let's say, European variety of capitalism or the Anglo-Saxon variety. So under this unique variety of capitalism, we might expect different dynamics between distribution of economic power and distribution of political power in society. And just to repeat the same idea, well, we have this Arab inequality puzzle that in the region we have relatively little income and consumption inequality, but we have a low level of development and political instability. So one idea is that, well, corruption is a very important component here, which might represent some kind of latent dimension of the multidimensional inequality. We might have to talk about corruption to understand the true scope of inequality in the region. Okay, so as I said, this analysis started globally with 186 countries, not just highly developed countries, which are typically used in these studies. My data set includes 20 MENA region countries, more than 3,000 country year observations, different measures of economic inequality, and different measures of observed or perceived corruption in the region. I will end up using the Gini coefficient of income as the main measure of inequality, and the control of corruption index as the main measure of corruption, but similar analysis was performed on other measures. But for data availability and for results, these two indicators that I ended up using are the best. So regardless of what the measure of inequality and corruption is, even though these variables come from reliable sources, they are very challenging variables. It's difficult by one variable to capture all the dimensions of corruption and all the dimensions of inequality. And they are very highly persistent variables. There are very small changes in them, even across 5 or 10 years. And so it would be hard to explain the small changes in these variables by contemporaneous or lagged socioeconomic factors. Okay, so to try to identify the either causality or the dynamic relationship, I will use the variables in first differences, where the differences will be of various lengths. So for example, I will look at a 3-year change in corruption in a country, and I will link it to lagged 3-year or 10-year difference in inequality in the country. So in order to get the coefficients of a bigger size, just because year to year we would find essentially zero relationships. And I will control, on top of this use of first differences, I will include random effects or fixed effects to capture any remaining between country heterogeneity in the changes in inequality and changes in corruption. Okay, even with these methods, or particularly because I'm using these careful methods, I will be expecting very weak measures of fit. I'll run relatively quickly. Here we see the distribution of inequality across country groups with a different level of economic development on the left, and on the right we see the distribution of inequality across countries with different market systems. We see on the left we see that the MENA region has a moderate level of income inequality compared to upper middle, lower middle, low income countries, but it has a higher level of inequality than high income countries. On the right graph, we see that the MENA region is on the right, so income inequality is higher. So here on the right, we are focusing among more developed countries for which we can easily identify the variety of capitalism. So they're all capitalistic systems. And here, the MENA region has a higher income inequality than liberal market economies, than state-led, so East Asian non-liberal market economies, and particularly higher inequality than coordinated non-liberal market economies in Europe. Okay, so these are well-known, I think, facts. In terms of the level of corruption, MENA region is comparable to upper middle income, lower middle income countries. It performs a little bit better than low income countries, but it performs significantly worse than high income countries in terms of corruption. In the right graph, the MENA region is completely at the right. So among these higher developed economies, MENA region has a much higher corruption than liberal market, state-led non-liberal market, and coordinated non-liberal market economies. Okay, so again, the basic message is that in the region, the level of inequality is medium or above median, but the level of corruption is clearly high. Now, looking at the association between inequality and corruption, on the left side, we show the decade 2003 to 2012. On the right, I show the decade 2013, 5 years, essentially 2013 to 2017. And we see that, again, and this is limited to higher income countries, where I distinguish the variety of capitalism. We see that the MENA region is at the right of having high inequality, and it's at the top of the graph having high corruption. And what is interesting here is the relationship between inequality and corruption within each group of countries. So among coordinated non-liberal economies, the blue group, we see a clear positive relationship between inequality and corruption. We see the same thing among state-led non-liberal market economies, the green group. But among liberal market economies, we see a very low correlation, very flat line. And we see the same thing among MENA region countries. So very little association between inequality and corruption in levels. Okay. Looking at this, the same idea, but looking at changes in the inequality on the horizontal axis and change in corruption at the on the vertical axis. Many of the trends disappear because, again, the changes in inequality and changes in corruption are very small. But I think I don't have a strong message here. I can skip to the next slide. So, but we do see slight differences between say state-led non-liberal market economies, the green line, having a positive
Vladimir,
relationship between.
Yeah, Vladimir, can I interrupt
Yes?
you? Can you use the full screen mode so that our participants could see the slides more clearly?
Sure.
Yeah,
Pardon
and if you
me.
could just wind up your presentation. Also.
Yep. Would this be a little bit better?
Yes, that's much better. Thank you.
Okay, so just focusing on changes in inequality and corruption, we still see some differences across groups of countries. Positive trend, positive relationship among in the green group and possibly the blue group of countries, the coordinated, either state-led or European market systems. But zero or negative trend among MENA countries. And so that shows a little bit of the relationship between the variety of capitalism and the association between inequality and corruption. Turning to the level of development, so again, in levels, if we distinguish high income, upper middle, lower middle income countries and MENA, we see that among high income countries, there's a clear positive association between inequality in levels and corruption in levels, but it seems negative, I guess, negative or zero relationship for lower middle income countries and MENA countries. So again, this slide and the previous slide suggest that there are different channels explaining the relationship between inequality and corruption, and we should probably turn to multiple regression to distinguish the effect of economic development here, and on the previous slide, the system of the market system in place. Okay, same graph looking at the change in inequality and change in corruption. We don't see any trends here. We might pick up some small differences in slopes between high-income countries and let's say the MENA countries, but I don't have any story. This slide is not the silver bullet explaining anything, and but I think
Vladimir, 5 minutes, if I could.
Okay, perfect. I think I'm almost done. So now just turning to the regressions, where on the left-hand side we have the change in corruption over 3 years or 10 years. I've tried different legs, and on the right-hand side of the equation, I have many institutional controls, including the variety of capitalism, the level of economic development, a time trend. And on this slide, I just show the coefficient on the change in inequality. And I distinguish MENA, the coefficient among MENA countries, and the coefficient in all comparison groups of economies. And what do we see? So looking at the blue line on the left, we see that the coefficient on change in inequality is negative among poor countries. Let's say the bottom 4 deciles of national income per capita, but it turns negative and growing with the level of economic development. So among the richest high income countries, there's a strong positive association between trend in inequality and trend in corruption. I don't think we can interpret it causally, but at least dynamically we can say that observing an increase in inequality is typically associated with increase in corruption down the line. a few years later. By contrast, in MENA countries, we have a negative coefficient. One way I interpret this slide is that in this graph, MENA region doesn't look like lower middle income countries or upper middle income countries. It looks more like low income countries. And we could think that so the interplay between the levels of inequality and corruption and the interplay between them, in that sense, the MENA region is kind of undershooting compared to where it should be. It behaves as a group of low-income countries, right? So in the left graph, the difference between the left graph and the right graph is in the left graph, I use the Gini coefficient. In the right graph, I use some top income shares, so top 10% income share. And so as a different measure of inequality and concentration of income in societies, but we see exactly the same trend. This result follows through if I add random effects to the equations. Once again, the MENA region looks very much like the poorest 10% or poorest 20% of countries, but it doesn't look like the group of lower middle, upper middle, or high income countries. But the standard errors are much wider because of the random effects method used. Fixed effects, once again, the standard errors are wider. The results on the right, there are no results there because of the width of the confidence intervals. But even here with the fixed effects, which are highly intrusive method, we still see that the MENA region compares to the low-income countries rather than lower middle, upper middle, or high-income countries. Just as a last illustration, suppose that at year 0, the Gini coefficient of income increases by 1 percentage point. The question is, what happens to the degree of corruption in society? So, so at year 0, Gini coefficient jumps by 1 percentage point and stays at that level. And that suppose that at year 5, the Gini coefficient of income again increases by 1 percentage point and then continues increasing by 1 percentage point every year. So here in this graph, I wanted to capture what are the level changes and what are the trend changes of these developments. We see that what happens in the MENA region, the level is clearly different. So corruption is much higher than in the other groups of countries, but the trend looks very similar to the trend in liberal market economies, so the Anglo-Saxon group, but it looks very different from the trend in coordinated European markets economies and the state-led East Asian coordinated market economies. Okay, just briefly conclusions. So inequality seems to affect corruption positively in some developed countries, particularly state-led non-liberal market economies. The effect is weakest or negative in liberal market economies or in the MENA region. So we do find that economic power translates directly into political power in highly networked, coordinated societies, but the link between the two spheres is indirect in economies with where transactions are done at arm's length, like the liberal market economies. If we believe this story, then we would group the MENA region along with the liberal market economies. But to the extent that we feel uncomfortable with that grouping, I need better explanations why MENA region behaves or looks this way, even though the institutions are different here. Thank you so much. I think I've covered all my material.
Okay, thank you very much, Vladimir. We'll depart from the usual format. I'm not going to give you comments on this paper. I will do so right at the end of the session because Walid Merouani has to go to another meeting in 30 minutes. So we can proceed straight to Walid's paper. Walid Merouani is a researcher at the Center for Research and Applied Economics for Development. He is going to talk about informal sector and politics using a very large data set, survey data that was compiled by the European Union. So, Walid, please start off, and when you finish, I'll offer comments on both the papers and open the floor for discussion. Walid, over to you.
Thank you, Adil. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm happy to present this article authored with Rana Jawad from the University of Bath. The aim of this article is to see whether informal workers are willing to participate to politics and state affairs. We'll work on 5 Arab countries that are Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Lebanon, and Egypt. So the outline of my presentation would be on 5 points. After a short introduction, I will quickly present the literature review, and then I will describe the data and move to the empirical result, and then I will conclude by some policy recommendation. So my motivation for doing this article is the high informality. First of all, the high informality in Arab countries. We have more than half of workers work informally in Arab countries. Also, the informal workers' needs and expectations still misunderstood by government. And we know that political participation is important so that informal workers will be understood, and government will understand what are the expectations of informal workers so that they can involve them in the formal economy. And there is a huge research gap between research gap in the literature in highlighting informal workers' political participation. So indeed, when we reviewed the literature, the previous study were focusing on the duality in labor market between formal and informal sector. We can mention Dosoto and Arisi Todaro, that those studies were very discussed in the recent literature. Some other authors have been looking for the fact whether informality is voluntary choosing or it is a strategy of last resort. Some studies that we have identified also is to look for the demographic and socioeconomic characteristic of informal sector workers and formal sector workers. Al-Badawi have done in 2008 an extensive research on informality in Arab countries, and I think he covered many issues related to informal labor market in Arab countries. With regard to informality and politics, we didn't find too many articles regarding this, doing the relationship between informality and politics, except Rudra in 2002, who were testing the impact of informal labor on social security development and democratic politics in India, Egypt, and Jordan. And other articles have been studying the case of other societies. For example, Campbell has studied the senior citizen political participation in the US, and Thornton has studied the impact of informality on political participation in Mexico. So our research question is, are informal workers in Arab countries willing to participate to politics and state affairs? To answer this question, we were using Sahwa survey, which is a survey conducted by the European Union with their respective partners in the respective countries. This survey has covered 2,000 households in each of Algeria, Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, and Tunisia. And in each household, we have picked one young respondent and asked him questions about political participation, but also about socio-economic situation, behaviors, and values. So the survey is quite big, and we have selected some variables to measure political participation. So here in this paper, I have built 4 indexes to measure political participation. The first one is, I called it involvement, because the questions that I have used is asking people whether they are involved in political party or whether they are involved in political movement that is not a political party. So here I construct dummy variable. One means that people are involved in a political party or political movement, and 0 if they are not involved. The second index of political participation, I have built it relying on some questions asking people how often did they participate to political party meeting or activities, how often did they participate to electoral campaigns, how often did they participate to politics via internet during the last 12 months. So here I combined 3 questions to build an index of political participation. And of course, people who participate at least once a month, I put them in category of people who participate in politics, and people who never participate or few times a year, I put them in the category of people who are not participating into politics. The third index is talking politics. I built it using questions about asking people how often do they speak about national political affairs, about international political affairs, about economic issues with parents and siblings and friends and colleagues. So people who rarely or never speak about these issues, political issues, I put them in the category of people who don't participate to politics. However, people who regularly, often, or sometimes talk about politics, they are in the category of people who participate. Last but not least, the last index of political participation is voting, and it is made by only one question, asking people whether they vote when elections are called. People who rarely or never vote are considered that they are not participating into politics. However, the 3 other categories are considered that they participate, they are politically active. I have used the empirical results show some interesting differences across countries, but I will not stay long time in this slide. The more important slide is this one, comparing between formal and informal workers' political participation. So for each activity, we can see that formal workers are more likely to participate to politics for each activity. For example, 22% of workers, formal workers, participate to political meetings, and we have 18% who participate from informal workers. But this descriptive statistics doesn't tell us too much about the significativity of difference between formal and informal workers. This is why we have used an econometric model, logistical regressions, to test the impact of informality on political participation. But we have also tested the impact of other variables on political participation. So I have run 4 models for each index. of political participation. So I have dependent variables are the four index that I was describing. I tried to predict this political participation by informality, job satisfaction, confidence in government, and another vector of socio-demographic variables. Informality here is defined by people who are not registered to social security system. So informal workers in this paper means that workers that are not registered in social security system. The result of this models shows that informality, people who have an informal employment are less likely to participate to the four activities, the four political activities, and the result is significant in the four models. So in the model one, we have found negative impact of informality on involvement, and for example, in the model D, informal workers were less likely to vote when elections are called. We have found also a negative impact of job satisfaction on participation and on voting behavior also. People who were more confident in government were more likely to participate to politics, and this is valid for the four models. It is worth noticing that here the definition of political participation, or the activities that they have chosen to measure political participation, it is a formal political participation, because one can think about other political participation, like participation in unions of workers, unions of informal workers, and so on. This kind of informal political participation is not treated in this article. So this article only talk about the let's say formal political participation, that are participation to vote and to political parties and so on. We have found that male are more likely to participate to politics. They are more likely to talk about politics, and they are more likely to vote. Age we didn't find significant impact in the second model, but in the third and the fourth model, we have found that older people are more likely to talk about politics, and they are more likely to vote. We have found also a positive impact of education on political participation, especially in the first model and the model C in the third model, talking politics. Married people were more likely to participate to politics. If we compare unemployed people to employed people, we have find that unemployed people are more likely to participate to political parties, meetings and activities. Maybe one explanation of this result is that they have more free time to participate to these meetings. However, they are less likely to vote. Students were more likely to participate to politics compared to employed people, and they were less likely to vote. Employees, comparing to self-employed, they're less likely to participate to the three activities of political participation, and we didn't find a significant impact of this variable on voting. We can notice that people in urban areas are more likely to be involved in political party or movement. They were more likely to participate to political party meetings, and they were more likely to talk politics. However, they were less likely to vote, and they will come back to this fourth model, because voting activity, it is political participation, but it is quite, the literature and this model shows that voting behavior is quite different than other political participation activities. This is why we didn't find the same sign of relationship between the socio-demographic variables and the variable of voting. People in private sector were more likely to vote, to be involved in politics, and they were more likely to talk politics. So to conclude, this article is an attempt, a first attempt to challenge an understudied topic in our countries. some policy recommendation is that we should make political participation easy to women and youth, because we have found that women are less likely to participate in politics, and young people are also less likely to participate in politics. Providing the needed information. So one way to make political participation easy is to providing the needed information and remove the barriers toward this political participation. Also, the behavioral economic field shows that reminding people about the importance of political participation could nudge them and incentivize them to participate. And last but not least, we think that voting behavior is quite different than other political activities, and the next research need to treat it carefully and separately. Over to you, Atil. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Walid, for this presentation. I'm going to now share my slides, and all right. I hope you can see my slides. Okay, so I'm going to start with my brief comments on Vladimir's paper. It's basically looking at implications of inequality for corruption. Now, the issue about this is that, you know, a lot of the data on inequality, we know there are usual problems in terms of interpreting inequality data, because, you know, a lot of the inequality based on surveys in the Middle East are not very reliable, and there is work that the ERF itself has published on that. Let me see, for some reason, I cannot start my video. Okay, now it's fine. All right, and similar issue is with corruption indices, because a lot of the corruption indices are perception-based indices, which obviously carry their own challenges. But for what it's worth, what the paper is doing is basically offering us cross-country evidence that's based on fixed effects panel regressions. There's a large sample of countries, about 186 countries, for this period 96 to 2017, about 30-year period. It offers a lot of robustness tests, different measures of corruption and inequality. The overall analysis is well done. I think the key point that everybody would appreciate is really that there's heterogeneity in the relationship between inequality and corruption perceptions, in the sense that in some of the OECD highly developed economies, there's higher inequality is associated with higher corruption perceptions. In other developed countries, the relationship is different depending on the type of the capitalist model that they're pursuing. And I think the highlight of the paper is really trying to use these varieties of capitalism approach to then estimate this relationship. So there's a lot of heterogeneity that the paper comes up with. As you would have guessed, a lot of the strengths of the paper are really in the thoughtful empirical work that's been done, and in furnishing very stylized patterns of heterogeneity, lots of robustness tests, lots of interesting tables, many of them Vladimir was not able to show us today, but there's a lot to take away from his paper. Now, in terms of some questions, I mean, the key question is, can we interpret the results pointing towards some type of a threshold effect by income? And there's clearly non-linearity, but it's not as such directly tested. And it's important to deal with that question upfront. I think there's larger inequality literature, which is empirical in nature and has highlighted threshold effects. It's worth making that explicit. I think in terms of finalizing this paper, we've got to be careful and think about, okay, what would this paper bring on board? Apart from what we already know in inequality and corruption. That has to be set out more clearly, and I have some suggestions on that account. The third question is, obviously there's an interesting relationship, but very difficult to sell it to a referee unless we know what the underlying mechanisms are, what are the underlying explanations. So much like the first paper, the paper I'm going to review after this one, it offers a very interesting stylized fact, but there's a lot more. It is raising more questions than it's actually answering, which is fine at this stage. My worry is that we are really looking at a reduced form relationship and a stylized fact. So unless we have a very good sense of the mechanisms, a clear theoretical prior of what to expect, it would be difficult to sell the paper to a referee. So there's need for more work on that. And my main suggestion would be that given that the results that are more interesting are around this sort of varieties of capitalism approaches, maybe the paper could be rewritten and reframed in ways that it poses the puzzle directly by linking this debate with varieties of capitalism approach and say, okay, there might be different types of relationship depending on the type of capitalist model you are following, and with a clear set of priors on that, and then test it. So I think that framing and generation of clear and testable hypotheses in the first two sections is very important. Another suggestion is that there's lots of different corruption indices floating around. And one of the things that you could do is to sort of draw on Acemoglu's approach in general political economy on the paper on democracy and growth, and then look at a variety of democracy indicators, many of which are perception-based, and then combines that information to define a less noisy measure that's based on all these different types of data sets. You could do the same thing in principle of corruption. I guess you're using the World Inequality database. Maybe I missed in the paper, but I think it's worth making that explicit if you haven't done so. But overall, I think my sense for the paper is it's a very interesting stylized fact. We need to know a bit more. And given that the results are pointing more towards varieties of capitalism approach, you need a theoretical framework. You need the overall framing of the paper in ways that generates testable predictions for that hypothesis, and then test it. But overall, very fine piece of work. The third paper by Walid and Rana Jawad is also very interesting, and it broaches an issue that cuts straight into a gap in the literature, which is that we know that informal sector is large in the MENA region, yet we don't know what's their level of political participation, how do they engage with politics. And to answer this question, the empirical setup relies on this very large survey as part of the Sahwa project, as part of which data was collected for Algeria, Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, and Tunisia. Around 10,000 young people were surveyed for this data set. And then it sort of explores how informal workers differ relative to formal workers in their levels of participation. And we find that informal sector workers are much less likely to participate in politics. And we are talking about politics as formal politics, electoral politics. There are other kinds of politics that they could be part of, but that clearly is not part of the exercise here. There are also interesting differences in terms of how levels of participation differ by inactivity, private sector versus public sector, urban, lots of other interesting variables. As I mentioned, a key strength of the paper is that it's trying to address an important gap that exists in the literature, and there's a very large and interesting data set that is used to generate, once again, an interesting stylized fact. Now, some of the questions that reading this paper one comes up with is that, yes, there's lower political participation in formal sector, but is that, for example, can it be linked to the restricted role of Islamic political parties? Because there's a lot of qualitative contextual evidence to suggest that the informal sector tends to band around politically amongst Islamic political parties. And the fact that a lot of the Islamic political parties, apart from Tunisia and many of the other Arab countries, are usually under the eye of the storm. They don't get a free room, political room. To what extent this low participation could be linked with that? That's a question, interesting question that comes up after looking at these stylized facts. The second question that came up was that, yes, there are differences, but are these differences sort of meaningful? Because in some of the tables, the differences looks pretty small. I also wondered the extent to which the Sahwa dataset allows us to capture within country regional fixed effects. So whether you're part of the interior or the coastal region, or whether you're in the urban and rural areas. To that extent, that's captured. But I think more sort of regional heterogeneity could be very important, especially for many of the North African countries, but also for others. In the end, I'm sort of left with the same worry, but also a suggestion, is that we are looking at a very interesting fact. Now, how can we situate it in an interesting hypothesis? And to do that, we have to actually step out of economics and look at the literature authority in politics on how the informal sector is organized. What is the politics of the informal sector? How does that politics vary between authoritarian states and democratic states? Can we come up with interesting predictions that we could explore here, and explore heterogeneity amongst Arab countries is another important aspect. There are a couple of suggestions, which I'm sure I can leave these slides with Walid, that he can look at it and come back to me and discuss it further. I feel that it would be useful to have a little subsection on Sahma survey that explains its main features, the setup, sub-regional fixed effects I've talked about, but also thinking about distinguishing informality. If you are in the border regions, the nature of informality is very different from if you are in the urban or peri-urban settings. And again, having some sort of regional identifiers would be useful for whether those responses are being generated from individuals in the peripheral regions. I've already talked about the political science literature and seeing if you could think about interesting dimensions there. In terms of empirical design, I mean, this is clearly one point in time data, but it's very large data set. And I wonder if there are any interesting sharp discontinuities that exist by level of participation, by region or other relevant characteristics. And if so, you could use it, that sort of discontinuity, to set up a regression discontinuity design, which would be very interesting. So that's it. Let's open the floor for discussion and see if there are questions that would be that people would like to pose. Any questions or comments from the floor? I can't see any in the Q&A dialog box. I don't see many questions. So maybe I could give Vladimir and Walid time to respond, and maybe in that time we could have questions from the floor. So Vladimir, if you would like to respond or react to my comments.
Thank you, Adil, for the generous and good comments. So yeah, I take them constructively that I need to work on identifying the mechanisms, the channels linking inequality and corruption together, and and possibly recollect newer data to update it to the situation this year. Your comment about the quality of the indicators, let's say the measurement of inequality and the measurement of corruption, those are kind of unsolvable problems. I think there is a little bit of discussion in the paper, but I can add more discussion on what kind of bias this introduces, whether this just changes the level or even some trend, if we account for the omission of the richest or maybe the poorest individuals from the measurement of inequality. But thank you so much for the comments.
Okay, thank you very much. And another question is that, comment is that your paper is actually written as, here is a relationship between inequality and corruption perceptions. And this is how it varies by the type of economic model that you have. Now, another way of writing that paper would be to say, okay, you start the paper by talking about, we know inequality and corruption has been linked, but there's heterogeneity. And this paper is going to look at a particular type of heterogeneity, which is according to the type of a capitalist model a country follows. And then you need to have some sort of description, some theoretical priors. Why should we expect the varieties of capitalism approach to be linked with inequality, corruption, literature? So you sort of set the paper up so that the reader then looks at your results and say, okay, here's why these two things are related, and here's why this heterogeneity matters. And then you look at the results and see, yes, indeed, this relationship varies by varieties of capitalism. So that's just a quick. Hani, you had a question. Thank you. Hani, you had a question. Would you like to ask a question, Hani Abdul?
Yes. Can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Adil. And I'd like to thank all the presenters for their very interesting work. My questions are related to first Walid's paper, the last one. I just want, it's more asking for a clarification. When you I'm not familiar with the Sahwa survey, so I don't know how it is constructed, but I can see that you have a number of countries, but then in your results, I wasn't sure really in the estimated model how whether you run this as a pooled regression where you actually have all these countries together. And I think that is linked to what Adil said before, within country heterogeneity. But actually, I'm actually wondering if even cross-country heterogeneity is there, because I don't think we can think of Tunisia and Algeria and all the other countries are the same. They have different nature in their political system, education, everything. So I don't know how that was taken care of in the estimation. So this is just a general question for clarification. But also, I think another point related to what Adil said about the quality of surveys from the MENA region, which actually this is a comment he pointed to related to Vladimir's paper. But I think the same comment is actually more relevant to Walid's paper. Given the situation, given what we all know about how the restrictions on political participation in the MENA region in general, and even most of these countries that actually in your data set. So how much can we rely on these results in explaining the relationship between informality, or explaining informality and political participation, in the same time that we actually know that talking in politics or about politics, it can actually you can end up in trouble. So how much I can rely that those who filled in those surveys, actually these are self-reported surveys, are actually credible, or something that I can get something out of. Just very quickly, like one comment about the other paper, I think it was, sorry, I think I lost my notes. So I think I'll stop here just to see if Walid can address this comment, and if I find my notes for the other paper, I'll just come back.
Thank you very much, Hani. Vladimir.
No response from me.
Okay. Walid, would you like to respond to?
Yes. Thank you, Adi. Thank you, Hani. Very interesting comment and questions. I will start by the first questions about the comparison between countries. Actually, I have mentioned some limitation of the Sahwa survey in my paper. This survey, because I was working only on workers, even if this survey have covered 10,000 household, so one individual by household, so 10,000 individuals. But by focusing only on the workers, my sample was reduced to 2,900, and if I do the cross-country comparison, the sample by country will be very small. So I didn't get statistical significance when I work when I try to do the comparison by countries. So this is only due to the sample size, but the exercise can be done if the sample size was greater. Sahwa survey is still reliable, and it is very used in the recent literature and the political participation. I have clarified how did I measure political participation, but we can think about other activities that measure political participation. Talking about politics is one of the activities that can reflect or can measure political participation, but we can think about other variables that I haven't included maybe in my paper. With regard to Adil's comment about Islamic political parties, we didn't test the impact of this variable, but at least in the MENA region, in the North African countries, where I know the context more than Egypt and Lebanon, I didn't see literature talking about the impact of Islamic parties on political participation, and there is no formal barrier that stop informal workers from participating. I have also read one of the one paper related to the to Adil's comment about the authoritarian regime and political participation, and I have understood that literature is not conclusive regarding this point. For example, we can say that authoritarian state and regime can give less. Can cover less workers and by social protection system. However, we can see other countries where we have authoritarian regime, but they have covered many workers, as in China and Vietnam, by social protection system. So the impact of the regime on political participation is not really conclusive according to what I have read so far. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Walid. This is clearly a very interesting piece of work, and it just needs a bit more refinement in terms of bringing in some interesting region-specific hypotheses. But great work. Is there any other question? Unfortunately, I can't see any hands here, but it seems to me that there's no more question to be asked, in which case I should just thank the speakers, all the three speakers, for the great work and their presentations, and would like to extend my gratitude on behalf of the ERF team to all the participants. Thank you very much for joining us, and we very much hope that you will be able to participate in our next ERF webinar. Thanks everyone, and stay blessed. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.